I'm Judy Neubauer. I'm HFI's Training Operations Manager. I really want to thank you for spending an hour with us. I know we're all busy and we appreciate your time. We really want to add some value to you today through our webinar. And I just have one quick reminder. If you have questions for Rob and Abdul, please put them in the chat box. I'm not sorry, put them in the question box, not the chat box, so that it's easy for them to see and find your questions. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Abdul Suleiman and Rob Berini, and I'm going to let them, they're going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves, and then jump right in. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Judy. Can you guys see my screen? Rob, looks good. Cool.
Yeah, looks good.
All right, guys. Welcome to Crafting UX Strategy in the Age of the Experience Economy. It's really about UX linked to business, and we're going to show you how that works. But a little round of introductions. Rob?
Yeah, Rob Berini. Thanks for having me, Abdul and Judy. Happy to join this session. I've got about over 25 years of experience in the digital strategy, design, innovation, and transformation space. Recently with UBS, leading as part of what I led was the design team and research team amongst other functions. And then about 9 years total with Deloitte Digital. Was there when we started our studio model, actually when we launched the Deloitte Digital brand, and was a managing director in charge of customer strategy and applied design, where we did a lot of digital strategy and UX strategy for our clients. And then career before that with IBM and Cisco and some couple other spots. But really happy to join the session and kind of share my perspectives and have a dialogue with all of you.
Awesome. And my name is Abdul Suleiman. I'm with Human Factors International. I'm a UX leader and educator. I've been in the field for about the same number of years as Rob. And I'm also a CUA and CXA certification instructor. And I've taught about 14 unique UX course titles across over 40 Fortune 500 companies, universities, government agencies, and in addition to consulting work that I've done with them. And I feel like there's a great synergy between teaching and consulting, where the research in the teaching, the abstract can become more concrete, and vice versa, bringing the work experience into the classroom. So a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to start with some definitions of what it means to engage in UX strategy. And this is according to definitions that are in the industry. Our definition at Human Factors International, in addition to other ones, we'll also be going into a very big topic that people have in their organizations, and that is return on investment, the business value. Why should business care about UX and UX strategy? And then the process and frameworks about how we go about making that UX strategy work in the organization in a systematic way. And then thinking about the organization and the culture, which is so important to support this process and framework. And finally, how you can contribute more to that effort in your organization with the right skill set.
Great. So we wanted to start with just a reflection on some of the definitions of UX strategy. How is it different from business strategy, which is, I think, the natural question, right? And really, there's a few perspectives that we've captured from HFI, from NN Group, and from IXDF over the next few pages, and you can find lots of different strategies. I won't kind of read through all of these. I just wanted to highlight some of the common elements, and I'll use this HFI one to start with. One is a UX strategy is user-centered, right? So as opposed to a business strategy, which tends to be kind of market or industry-centered, competitive-centered, we're really about the users, making sure that we're serving user needs and that we deeply understand and empathize with those user needs. The second aspect that is pretty consistent across these definitions, and we'll share the other couple in a second, is the aspect of experience, right? It's about this strategy is around something that you actually don't have control of, which is how does the user experience what you've built? How does the user experience what you've designed? And that's really what we're trying to influence in terms of our strategy. Some of the other aspects that are not really unique to UX strategy that are shared with business strategy are around an outcomes focus, an action plan focus, a time horizon focus, and you can kind of argue around what's the appropriate time horizon. Often it's too long. Often you have 3-year strategies and then they get put in the shelf, right? But how do you kind of craft, or at least have some sense of how do we keep ourselves accountable? And then this aspect of a point of departure and point of arrival here defined as UX vision. And often, again, sometimes people mistake strategy as synonymous with vision. Vision is a part of it, but the statement of ambition, the statement of vision is not sufficient in order to define UX strategy. So those aspects are pretty common. We can slip to the other couple, and you can reference these later or kind of Google them again. Action, time period, future state, i.e. point of arrival, and IXDF we can hit as well. Again, what's the course of action? User focused, experience focused. In my mind, what's missing from these definitions is a dimension of being adaptive, right? Strategy is not a fixed thing. Strategy is around making choices based upon current conditions and assumptions and testable hypotheses. I'm a big fan of discovery-driven strategy, which is kind of reverse engineering the strategy and saying, okay, here's what we think the future will be. How do we backcast into that? And how do we measure that? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, really around making informed bets, right? You're making choices and you have to measure and analyze those choices. Are they the right choices? Are we seeing what we expected to see relative to our users? So that's kind of one aspect of this that I think is missing in these definitions that is important, is the aspect of adaptive. It's kind of maybe implied or assumed, but I think it's important to be explicit around the adaptive nature of strategy. The other aspect that is pretty common in business strategy that isn't as much referenced here, but is very important, is the strategic context. So how are user needs evolving, right? What is our understanding of those evolving user needs? How are demographics evolving? How is their expectations evolving, et cetera? The second aspect is, how's the competitive landscape evolving, right? It's not as explicitly mentioned here as it is in typical business strategy, but it is important what are competitors doing in terms of their user experience. The technology changes, the elephant in the room here being AI and current days, but what is the technology landscape? How are form factors changing, devices, et cetera, super important, obviously, to an articulation of the UX strategy. Where do we think we're going to be? What is important for us to build? And then finally is the UX UI trends, glass and those types of things in terms of, okay, these are the evolving patterns and evolving design and paradigms that are emerging within the industry, and how do we incorporate those? So, but generally these definitions, I think, serve you well with those couple of modifications or addendums that I would put on them. We can move forward, Abdul.
I love that aspect of evolving and adapting internally to those evolving factors. I think that's an amazing thing that I would love to see more definitions. So I'm surprised. I think that's a very, very important insight there, Rob.
Yeah. So we'd love for you to, in the chat, I think in the chat, right, Judy, not in the Q&A. Q&A will reserve your questions. Just in the chat, if you're willing to kind of share, how is UX strategy defined at your organization? Just some highlights. Love to see some people kind of share that.
Just take a moment for you guys to get your thoughts together and share that. And one thing that's really cool, guys, is we have over 217 registrants for this webinar, and kind of just seeing all your thoughts coming together will help synergize that whole thought process and get you maybe thinking about another way to see your UX strategy. Just how, like Rob saw another way of evolving and adapting, you could see from each other's perspectives how this UX strategy could play out in your organizations. So feel free to share away.
Yeah, Charles shares not clear to define an organization, which is, I suspect, the reason for some silence here, right? Unfortunately, all too often, UX strategy is not defined, or not explicitly defined, and it's unclear kind of who owns it. And we'll talk a bit more around that. So we'll continue to monitor this as we have the discussion. But Joel, you want to kind of kick off our discussion on ROI, and then I'll pick back up.
Sure. So, so yeah, we're going to continue then with ROI here. And one thing that's really important to note, guys, is if we don't quite understand the value of UX in our strategy and our organization doesn't define it very well, then UX does not become a strategic priority for your organization. That's why it's helpful for us to now transition into that ROI side of things with regard to our UX strategy. So one brand that we wanted to quote that we wanted to share here is from NICE, in 2024 report, their research company, and Research Insights, and they found that brands excelling in customer sentiment outperformed their peers by an impressive 43% points in stock returns over 5 years. This is similar to an earlier McKinsey study that they built on. And this is really significant, guys. And so we're seeing from this that UX drives customer sentiment. Okay. If you don't have UX and then you don't have that sentiment to be affected to help really raise the value of your company, even, right? It's not just some kind of siloed thing. This is even at the company level. You're really being able to boost that value. Okay. It's not, and when we talk about customer sentiment, it's not just about how people feel, but it reflects trust, satisfaction, and loyalty, things that are very powerful and important for your brand, for your organization, for your business. And these positive sentiments emerge when users feel that ease of use, the clarity in the messaging, and in that journey, and the emotional connection they have during those interactions. And these are all outcomes of strong UX, again, tied to the strategy. And there's a financial impact of the experience. We talked about the 43% outperformance of stocks, and that is not insignificant. That is massive, 43%. That's crazy. Okay. It proves that UX and CX isn't just a cost center of like a graveyard of your capital, but it really is a profit multiplier that your organization can benefit from. And then we also have companies that invest in UX achieving better recognition, visibility, higher engagement, more advocacy by users, brand evangelists. All that is something that contributes to higher revenue and growth. And it also gives you a more competitive advantage where markets are saturated with similar products, right? Is it about becoming like your competitor? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Or is it about differentiating from your competitor in a way that's very meaningful to your users? Okay, that's what really makes you a leader, an experience that can deliver to your user base. And then brands that ignore UX and don't recognize it, they risk commoditization. And then they lower investor confidence in their brand. Again, something that would hurt the actual value of your organization versus really boosting it, as we're talking about. So what we're talking about as a strategic imperative here is that stakeholders need to see UX as part of that business strategy and not just design and pixels and pushing around pixels. And this metric is a persuasive tool to justify UX investments for executives because it links directly to the shareholder value that we're talking about here. Okay. Another really interesting study here that shows UX and CX drive business KPIs, key performance indicators, is loyalty can very easily be lost. Don't take it for granted. No matter, I know there's a significant number of really huge brands on this call right now. Again, I know the roster of who registered. Don't think that you're so big you can't fall. Okay, this happens to a lot of big companies where they think they don't have to care about loyalty because it's going to be there, it's secure, it's a given. It's not. If we don't pay attention to what's happening to our users, if they have a bad experience, according to this research right here, 31% of consumers stopped using a company after just one negative interaction in 1 year. In just 1 year. And in a whole year, one bad interaction, and they're considering just stopping using that service. Now, if that goes up to 2 to 5 times, this is showing 68%. Nearly 3/4 of people will completely stop using your product or service after that much time. So loyalty is not a given, it is earned, and it needs to be retained through the right process and UX strategy.
Great. It seems like some of these slides did get a little bit modified when
Oh,
we
okay.
moved,
Sorry.
unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah. But okay, so how do we talk about kind of success metrics, and how do we link
Mhm.
and describe that impact and ensure that we have ROI? Often what we're measuring is usage or usability in the UX profession. Sometimes what gets lost is the behavioral outcomes and user outcomes. Um, and the business outcomes are too often kind of disconnected from that, then the business outcomes being associated with revenue or referrals or retention. So take a business like Drumeo. Some of you may not be familiar with that, but it's a online learning platform for learning drums, right? And on the usage category, they may have things like site visits or trials or views on their YouTube. Usability is kind of self-explanatory, but ease of use and SUS kind of discussions. Behavioral outcomes are things like, did they take a lesson, right? Did they kind of download a PDF of a drum transcription, et cetera? User outcome then is really around measuring, what was the user's value, right? This is really getting into the value exchange, and too often in typical business strategy, we're not measuring that. We're just measuring the business outcome, but what was the user's impact? So they learned a new song, they increased their skill, they got a gig, they increased their pride, those kinds of things in the Drumeo example. And then ultimately leading to the business value of potentially new subscriptions, referrals, retention. If we can move to the next slide. What's important there is the ability to again kind of link those behaviors to the user outcomes, to the business outcomes. Business outcomes are often a lagging indicator, right? You're not going to get those referrals and retention numbers until after the action has occurred. Often the usage and usability numbers that we're measuring, while important, are at best leading indicators, but sometimes disconnected from the actual kind of user outcomes that we're trying to measure. So it's super important for us in strategy to ensure that we are measuring those user outcomes, right? What are they deriving, and how are we ensuring the value? How are we measuring our value proposition? If we can move to the next one, this is related to a concept that some of you may be familiar with, which is the business model canvas, which is a very popular way to articulate some of the business strategy decisions, and ultimately, what is the value proposition we're delivering? How do we manage that value exchange, right? So value given versus value captured in the revenue streams. What is our cost structure in order to deliver that business model, and ultimately kind of where the ROI kind of comes to bear. So if you haven't been exposed to the business model canvas, and you haven't seen or developed a business model canvas for the business you're supporting, if you're in the UX profession, I would highly advise you to do so that you understand the context. Some people have said UX strategy is alignment to business strategy. It is also alignment to the business model. How does the business make money? How do we properly articulate that value driver tree and kind of back into what are the user outcomes that we expect to see? What are the behaviors that we're trying to drive? Because that's ultimately where we're designing. We're designing for behaviors. What are those behaviors that we're trying to drive to ensure that we're touching that business model canvas? So that's one kind of value and understanding that UX professionals can derive in understanding the business. As an aside, we're not really talking about UX org strategy or UX functional strategy, but you could build the same thing for your UX org, right? How do we go to market within our internal organization? What's our value proposition to internal stakeholders? What does that mean for us in terms of resources and activities? What's our cost structure? All those kinds of things. Particularly if you're a UX leader, you may want to think about this business model canvas, even if you're internal facing. But back to the external facing piece, the other value that and we can move to the next slide, Abdul, that UX professionals can support is you can overlay on top of this the model that I assume you're all familiar with, which is the kind of typical IDEO-based. Is it feasible? Is it desirable? Is it viable? Right? This is your source of hypotheses, right? So the business model canvas is an articulation of choices, and we'll talk a little bit more around how you reach those choices, but it's an articulation of those choices that were made. Who, why, where, what, right, how, etc. And you can define hypotheses that you can test with end users in various methods, right? Quantitative and qualitative, typically advise a mixed methods process to really test, do we have the desirability that we think we will for this product or business to be successful? Can we test the feasibility, right? Will this work in the marketplace, particularly if it's an emerging technology? And do we have viability, right? Will it achieve the revenue targets at the cost that we're expecting? So UX professionals, particularly on the research side, can be super useful in trying to help to measure the chances of success, the odds of success for a business model. With that, we'll slip to kind of the process and frameworks for defining strategy. But before we do, we're just curious on some of your perspectives on how UX strategy is linked to ROI in your organization. If you could, again, use the chat.
Some of the comments we have in the chat about the previous question about UX strategy and definition, we hear that it's not very clearly defined in some organizations, and as Rob had mentioned. And then Chris has a really funny one. Our strategy is to fire the spaghetti cannon, spray and pray, right? So, right. So it's very ad hoc, right? Others, Shrikan, very well defined in our organization. William, strategy is really just about the leader trying to position in alignment with whatever executives were focused on at the moment. Because it was leading in the wrong direction. You can't change that ship, that course of that ship, right? So that's the direction they want to go. That could be problematic. One big question that comes up is, does UX have a seat at the table, right, with these executive decisions? So that's another part of organization and culture, make sure that you have UX going the right way, right? Yeah. Oh, also, by the way, guys, there's a link here. You see, humanfactors.com thinking favorite. I'm going to actually put that in the chat. Some of you who've taken the CUA courses would know what that's about, but those who have not, you may not know about what this is. It's really cool. It's actually some free ROI calculators that you could use to come up with your own calculations on whether a project, remember from what Rob was talking about, feasibility, viability, and usefulness, all that. Is it something that is worth it for you to do or not do based on this ROI calculation? You could check that out.
One thing that, just to close out this topic before we move into the related topic of processes and to your point around steering the ship, we use a iceberg metaphor, is how do you think about this as a UX professional, even if you're not explicitly in the strategy profession within UX or don't think of yourself as strategy? It's critically important for your portfolio, for your case studies, to be able to understand and articulate, this is the behavior I influenced, right, to the kind of value driver tree that we outlined earlier, through the UX decisions that I led or tested, right, as a UX professional in either design or research or both. And here's how it linked to the value that I provided to the business, right? And to really be thoughtful around that, even if you can't measure it in its entirety, it'll help you to kind of build that strategic muscle, but it'll also help you in your profession as you seek opportunities to be able to articulate how you really supported the end business decision. And by the way, some of you are in businesses where the UX strategy and the business strategy is almost synonymous because you're in a UX focused business or a mobile centric business or a single product business, but many of you are also in large enterprises where UX is sometimes very disconnected from the business strategy, or at least those linkages aren't obvious. So I would encourage you to think through that. Okay, so we can move on to the next section here.
Okay.
So in the discussion of process and frameworks, I lean pretty heavily on some established frameworks that are available for strategy within the industry, primarily because the last thing you need is for me to introduce another framework, right? There are plenty of great frameworks on how to think about strategy, and it's really more around how do we apply those frameworks to the concept of UX strategy when they were built for business strategy, which, to our discussion so far, has a lot of similarity and commonality. So as I kind of previewed, the first topic here is around how are UX strategy decisions manifested and what kind of ultimately gets presented as the surface experience. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'm still showing that. Great. So many of you would be familiar with Jesse James Garrett's Elements of User Experience. It's, in my view, kind of required reading as a UX professional. But what he kind of talks about and is true is that often what business stakeholders see and what the client sees is the surface experience. It's the visual design. It's what's concrete, right? What's articulated in the final kind of product decisions or experience decisions. When that's failing, it's usually a function of one of these other levels, right? And I think what's often underappreciated, and Abdul mentioned this earlier, is the role of a UX professional is actually not the surface. I mean, it's part the surface piece, of course, right? Especially if you're a UI or visual designer. But it's really around being able to link, even if you don't have an explicit role in defining the strategy, link and understand all those other levels, right? In terms of the skeleton, which is decisions around layout and patterns and consistent elements, the structure aspect, which is decisions around information architecture and conceptual models, how the designer's mental model links to the user's mental model, an articulation of the flows that you're supporting, the scope, which is around the business requirements and content requirements, and then ultimately the strategy. And this is what we'll spend most of the rest of our discussion in this section is around the why, the who, the where, the what, the how, and the how many of strategy definition, and around kind of articulating those choices and ensuring that you can draw a connection between what's being defined at the surface level, what is seen by users and stakeholders, to those strategic decisions. And everybody has a role in this. And this is, again, you may not think that you have a role in UX strategy, you may not be in a UX leadership position, but as a practitioner, you have a responsibility to understand your linkage to that strategy and be guided by that strategy. And it will enrich your ability to justify your design decisions and your research outcomes if you can provide that linkage, right, to both the UX strategy and the business strategy. Before we get into how the frameworks of how we define strategy, I wanted to talk about the linkage to design principles, which I think is an underlying piece that hits the skeleton and structure piece. If we can move to the next slide. So design principles are really value statements, and these aren't the same as kind of the principles and elements of design that those of you that went to design school might have learned. They are an abstraction of them maybe and very specific to the context of a particular business, but they're really around the consistent value statements that influence decisions, right, that help in prioritization. And again, I would really highlight and reinforce the decision aspect. So there may be things like, we prioritize accessibility, or we want a minimalist design, or our focus is designing for failure, or we want to ensure that there's a social dimension or commentary dimension in every aspect. Those are decisions, right? Those are design principles that influence the skeleton structure and scope of what you'll do, that sit on top of the strategy. They need to be consistent with the strategy. But the differences in those design principles will influence the differences you may see in the end product. So I'll take an example of Strava versus Training Peaks, if you're familiar with those examples. Strava has made decisions around very minimalist design. very social design, right? And that's part of their design principles. Versus the Training Peaks, which is very much focused on that coach interaction around deep and rich performance data, very data intensive. And you can see how those different value statements and different goals lead to different platforms that are really about the same thing, which is around improving your ability to track your exercise and activity, right? We can move on to the next one. So a lot of how I think about strategy, and this is partly as a function of at Deloitte, the Monitor firm had joined Deloitte a little bit after we defined Deloitte Digital, and Monitor used this playing to win strategy defined by A.G. Lafley of Procter & Gamble and Roger Martin of Toronto's Business School. But it's, I think, a very useful framework to think about strategy because it reinforces the aspect of strategies around making choices, right? It's around defining what you will do and also what you won't do, right? And being very explicit around what are those choices? How do we think we can win? And that's the other aspect that I think is super important is they use the term kind of, are you playing to play or are you playing to win? Now, within the context of UX strategy, maybe winning doesn't kind of resonate as much as a framework, but it ultimately is around how do we plan to achieve our ambition? How do we plan to achieve success? And to make sure that we're just not kind of in the game treading water, right, and doing enough, but that we actually have some kind of guiding principle that's driving us. And then we've defined the set of actions and choices that then meet that principle. So the other piece I wanted to highlight around this one is it's not guaranteeing success, and it's not to the concept earlier around being adaptive. It's around increasing the odds and then continuing to measure those odds, right? Did we place the right bets? You know, are the circumstances changing? Do we need to change that and constantly kind of monitor that, which is why the kind of governance and measurement part of that is so important as well. We can move to the next. So the Playing to Win framework defines strategy definition as a choice cascade. And we call it a cascade because the decisions that you make at an upper level cascade down, but the reverse is actually also true. So, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So the first thing is defining that point of arrival or vision, or what does it mean to win? What is that aspiration? How do you want to define yourself? And that, you know, is a function typically of the business strategy within a UX strategy, right? How do we define success? What does it mean for us to have a successful user experience function or team, or if we're successful in the marketplace with our users and the experience? Where we will play is actually a lot of the artifacts that hopefully you're already building as a UX professional. It's which personas do we prioritize? Which journeys do we prioritize? Which ones we focus on? Which moments within those journeys? How do we elevate those critical moments within the journeys? Which form factors or devices are we trying to serve? So it's really the playing field for your strategy and being very explicit around those. And again, making choices, right? We don't serve everybody. We're very explicit around which personas are important to us, which journeys are important to us over the next quarter or year in order to hit that kind of winning aspiration. The how do we win is around is the what, right? So what kinds of initiatives, what are we going to do over the next year? What are we going to prioritize? What are we going to build or design to help to ensure that we can capture value, going back to the business model canvas, within those key personas, journeys, and form factors that we've defined. And that's really the essence of what we would kind of typically think of as strategy. That's the plan, if you will. What Lafley and Morton correctly point out is that it's not sufficient to kind of end there, because often you'll articulate, I've seen a lot of visions that are disconnected from the ability to execute, right? And strategy really is around executing. So what does that then mean in terms of the capabilities? And are those realistic capabilities? Back to the feasibility component, right? Do we have the right talent? Do we have the right tools? Do we have the right partnerships in order to achieve this as a UX team, right? In the context of UX strategy. And then what management systems are needed to the concept of ROI. and measuring user behaviors and then user outcomes and business outcomes even, can we measure those things? Right. So I've seen a lot of organizations and been in organizations where your ability to measure outcomes is actually pretty limited by the data, right? Or it's hard to find. So you have to define then what are the proxy measurements that we can use, and how does that maybe influence the strategy? Because we have to ensure that all the decisions we're making around where to play and how to win are realistic decisions, right? So we talk a lot about kind of stretch goals. It's important to have, again, an ambition and aspiration, but that aspiration and vision has to be grounded in reality, your ability to execute. And that's what's key in UX strategy is, if we don't have the capabilities required, can we change that? If we don't have the management systems required, can we change that? And if we can't, then we need to redefine those other choices, right? The other choices around how we win, where we'll play, et cetera. Did we have a question come in, and is it a real-time question that we should answer now?
Take a look. Let's see.
Oh, so the question is, should we rely on personas or our user archetypes? Personally, I appreciate the richness of personas and the specificity, and I also think that personas are often specific to the product context or the problem context. So they sit in that problem space, not in the solution space. User architects are useful proxy for that, and sometimes are useful. And maybe people have different definitions of user archetypes. So personally, I still prefer personas, but user archetypes are a kind of similar construct that at least can help you make those prioritization decisions that say, these are the architects that I'm focused on, right? I think either are useful, although my preference is personas. Okay. The other piece here to strategic choice making then is, what is that problem that we're trying to solve? And this really gets into the how will we win, right? So the focus that you have as a UX strategist is understanding what's the problem space, what's either the opportunity or what's the pain point that we're trying to solve, in order to articulate a value proposition, in order to solve user needs with what we're designing or building. What are the possibilities in order to do that? Understanding those conditions, right? And this goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is, what are the assumptions? What are the hypotheses? What are the things that must be true, right? And too often we kind of, I think, sweep away those aspects. But how do we build confidence? What must be true? You have to reverse engineer these options. We have to figure out, okay, if this is going to work, then I need to be able to evidence these usage behaviors. I need to be able to evidence this usability. I need to be able to test desirability, feasibility, and viability in these ways. So all of these possibilities have conditions associated with them where they will be successful or not successful. And again, it's about placing bet and making choices. So those then define, as a UX professional, and particularly if you're on the research side, how do you test those, right? How can we go about getting confidence? Can we release false door kind of things within the environment? Can we do qualitative behavioral research to get at it? Can we look at analytics? There's a number of, do we do A/B tests? Whatever it may be, every condition will have specific things that can help you decide, gain more confidence, right? You'll never be 100% sure, but gain more confidence that we're making the right decisions, and then you're executing that choice, right? So kind of maybe an obvious framework in terms of that, but it bears articulating that strategy is choice making, right? It's, again, around deciding what we will do and what we won't do. And if we're changing the choices that we're making, we need to have justification for why we're changing those choices. And I would encourage you, if you're in the strategy profession, obviously, to kind of think through this. If you're not, or if the strategy is absent or is defined by the business, to try to productively challenge, not to be obnoxious, but to try to link, okay, help me understand why we think this is true. And can I help you get more confidence as a product owner or business leader that this strategy makes sense, and that we have the right behaviors that we're designing in our user experience in order to drive those user outcomes and business outcomes. Okay, move on. The other concept here that I think is valuable is another very well-established framework around red oceans and blue oceans. And this is the concept of, in a competitive landscape, right? And again, it's maybe more relevant to business strategy versus UX strategy, but I'll draw the connection here in a second. That we're often kind of fighting sharks in the same water, right? Fighting for the same territory, right? Trying to focus on beating the competition, exploiting existing demand. And what Kim and Marwa point out is that the opportunity is really to define where is there uncharted territory, where are there non-customers, right? Where are there people that are underserved or not served at all? How can we create an uncontested marketplace by creating something new? So if we can slip to the next slide, and I think this is where it's a useful framework to think about how does your UX strategy support that, and what choices or moves can you make to build something that is differentiated from the competitive landscape. What this kind of choice architecture or these blue ocean moves architecture articulate here is the things at the bottom are basically competing factors. And of course, this is just a generic one, but the typical examples are like, the ones kind of in the book are around Cirque du Soleil versus traditional Ringling Brothers Circus, and Netflix versus Blockbuster, but that's a very old, right? Some of you may not be familiar with that one, but think about like a Duolingo, right? Or an Airbnb proposition or Uber proposition. When you define blue oceans, you're trying to look at what's the current industry value proposition, where are the competing factors relative to price, relative to how it's delivered, relative to, in the case of Duolingo, gamification or social elements versus the richness of the content or the depth of the strategy. So what you're making decisions on in a blue ocean context is what's not important to us, right? So, and Abdul will talk about this in a second. Too often we're focused on like kind of like competitive parity charts of like what functions and features does my competitor have, where really we should be talking about what is our proposition and what does that mean for us in terms of we're not going to do this at all, right? Like it's not important to us to have this particular component of a competing factor, or we might reduce these. Our curve may look a little bit different than the industry. We may elevate or raise certain aspects of these. So the gamification or social aspects may be more important to us in a Duolingo. We may introduce, certain components to it. This is where the classic example of a Cirque du Soleil is they were introducing kind of artistic elements to it, right? Or kind of contained shows, almost in a Broadway sense, to the concept of a circus, where they eliminated things like animals and star performers and those types of things. So it's around defining, when you look at your the user experience that you're trying to define, and you look at the personas and journeys that you're serving and those moments that matter, how maybe do you think about those differently than the competitive landscape? And why do people choose you, right? What is the differentiators to the business? And how do you reinforce that from a user experience perspective that says, these are the things that are more important to us, or that we're going to introduce in terms of visualizations or functionality or other things that will allow us to better serve those users and potentially create, new markets. Great. Abdul, I'm going to pass on to you.
Awesome. Thanks. On that note of Duolingo, I will say that my kids are obsessed with Duolingo. I kid you not. There were times that they were in bed, about to sleep, and they jumped out of bed like in a panic. I didn't do my Duolingo yet. And it's so important that they do it, because if they don't, they're going to lose what's called their streak, right? This is the gamification that Rob is talking about too, right? How do you make a product that is so sticky and one that's so engaging? It's not just about comparing features, because feature comparisons are weak, as we're talking about here. And so here we have a comparison across these different clothes outlets and retailers. And it's just really about certain features, right? Just feature comparison alone is weak, and it puts you more in that red ocean that Rob was talking about. We're talking about here is differentiating, going beyond that and into a space like Duolingo, where it's something more of an experience that you're measuring for your audience, one that's very meaningful, useful, valuable to them and to you, that is not easily replicable by your competitors, because it's not just a feature, but it's an experience that you're crafting for them, right? So they can't, it's not a rat race. It's something that they can't just copy paste. It's something that is more reliable for you and safe for you as a business, and a UX strategy to have in place, right? So those are some things that we want to think about, right? Thinking about UX is about how easy and delightful the journey is, and not just whether the feature exists. Thinking about winning brands that optimize the flow, the persuasion, and trust, and not check feature boxes that are here, right? Yes, you could get some idea here. I'm not saying never do this, but don't rely solely on this and think I have a solid strategy, okay? Another way to see this beyond the feature is thinking about the workflows, right? So those same retailers that we just looked at, if we looked at the checkout experience for these three, right? So these three brands offer similar checkout stages, but their workflow complexity and decision points are varying here. The user friction isn't about the number of steps alone. It's also about how many decisions and interruptions occur. And so we've had some case studies that we've talked about. We don't have time to go into them, that show even sometimes you'll have more steps in the process, but those steps are more meaningful and result in significantly higher conversions at the end of the funnel, right? So really think through it. Don't say, okay, it's just about reducing the number of clicks. It's about really thinking about that user experience and how to make it really resonate with your users and work for your business. Also thinking about logical grouping and minimizing those interruptions in the process. And so we could do that once we get to workflow comparisons. And even taking that a step further, we could think about visualizations of that workflow and comparing it, where we have a green to red gradient here, showing that this is more smooth, less friction, but then going to friction. We could have these types of illustrations, these icons to kind of illustrate that and show what's happening, increase pay limit, things like that. And so you could say, oh, well, you know what? At this step 5, we need to do something better here. And you could improve that workflow so it's a lot greener and less friction, and which will reduce that cleaner and more linear type of workflow. Will have fewer disruptions, a more logical progression of steps, less abandonment and bounces, higher success rates, better user satisfaction. And it's also reducing the cognitive load of what the user has to think about, right? The frequency of errors, and thinking about the personas that we're designing for, coming back to the question before and what Rob answered about the personas. This persona will always trip up when they get to this step because of this language or this interaction, this design pattern. We think about the user experience in that way versus just feature checkboxes. It's a very different experience that ultimately also affects the support costs for your organization, for your business, because less people are calling in because they're frustrated, they have a problem with their order. And so that definitely affects your brand, as well as your support costs and ultimately your bottom line. Okay. Another example that we have to share here is UX benchmarking through a metric here, which is like a heuristic evaluation, right? So we're looking at best practices across certain dimensions, right? So we have these dimensions of navigation, information architecture, content, presentation layers, messaging, brand, persuasion. You could have a number of what are some dimensions that are meaningful to your organization? How are they tied to your strategy and to the priorities in your business and in your company, right? So thinking through that, and then rating across these different competitors, for example, how well that experience aligns to these different types of measures, these heuristics, is a very powerful thing you could do. In this example, we have a visualization of anything under 40% being in white. So any 1 to 5%, let's say 1 to 5, 5 being the highest rating for that thing, 1 being the lowest. and you have a UX expert rating this, and they find that anything below 40 is in the red here, white is medium, and highs are in green, as you could see. And so this is one way to visualize this and kind of prioritize how you compare. And then also thinking about your product and your innovation, okay? So this is something that's absent with a lot of organizations. They don't think about innovation, or they think about it in a superficial way, or they don't think about it in a systematic way, and they don't think about what type of innovation that we need to work with, right? So there's the market impact, there's the technology that we're working with. If you have a very novel product, technology, right? And it is something that has a very high impact, then you're talking about something that's very disruptive, right? Top right quadrant, right? Versus something in the lower left quadrant, which doesn't have too much of market impact, and the technology is already there. It's not all that different, you know. And we're not saying one is the best, one is horrible. We're not saying you have to do one or the other, but we want you to think what is right for you and define your strategy of, I need to do something that's more disruptive, and here's how we can. When Rob was talking about the capabilities of our organization, that also feeds into, can you deliver on something disruptive? Or do you have an existing product that you want to incrementally improve in a way that's still meaningful, but not at the disruptive level, right? There's also sustainability of that innovation. That's, of course, radical to something that's just very, very different of a technology, but not all that impactful in the market, which might be not worth it for you, potentially, if you're going to spend all this money. And then, so of course, AI plays a role in some of these things too, right, to think about. So we're going to pose this question to you guys to think about the types of innovations you're working on. I don't want you to post that here because we don't want to like spoil all your trade secrets with such a huge audience in this webinar, but we want you to think about that. Think about, ask yourself the question of the types of product innovations you're working on. Are they incremental? Are they disruptive? Are there something else? Be meaningful in those efforts. Okay. And we do have a UX strategy framework at HFI that we use. And just very high level, just for the sake of time, just to mention that we have these 3 different stages: the digital audit, looking at the digital ecosystem where we're implementing that change, and presenting the findings and aligning all that to our UX strategy of what we hear from our stakeholders, from our organizational priorities, and synthesizing that all together with our with regard to competitors and our user base to make it work. Okay. So going into our organization and culture, it may be sometimes a little bit daunting when we're thinking about those stakeholders that we're working with, and some of the illusions that they may have of this elephant of UX strategy and what it really is. That's why we posed that question very early on of what your UX strategy is. And it was very interesting to hear the different responses about, we don't have one, we think we have one, or we just do what the executive says we should do. And there's other types of illusions, that UX is research, that it's screens, it's the wireframing people, it's the look and feel, which is the tip of the iceberg that Rob was talking about. It's only design thinking. It's not my job, right? It's someone else's job. I can't contribute in any way, which is false. I'll say that in all of our teaching that we do, we don't only teach UX designers, UI designers, product designers. There's business analysts, project managers, VPs, marketing executives, content people, you name it. There's opportunities to contribute to this UX strategy and to UX, okay? So UX is time and money with no returns. Yeah, if you don't have a UX strategy and we're not linking our efforts to what business wants, then that's what it may become, right? So we have to be careful about that, right? So we also want to recognize that this is multidisciplinary, right? We are working together to make this UX strategy come alive and be effective, right? So many disciplines I just mentioned right now, other disciplines, the graphic artists, executives, the marketers, content folks, different levels of experience, We need to ensure that we're all working like a symphony to make that work for organizations. Okay, that's important for UX strategy, right? And for UX and the culture in your organization to support these efforts. Okay, so that's challenging, right? So some of you may say, "What can I do?" Right? What you could do is first ask yourself, where are you in the organization, right? Where's the core, right? And here's the core UX. These are practitioners, right? How do we have those who support our efforts in the organization? This is the middle management, right? Middle layer. These are influential collaborators. Then we also have our inner core of UX practitioners. And then we also need to have our sponsors who will come in to tie in these stakeholder outcomes together to make it work, right? So you need to think about that. You need to think about your executives bringing these perspectives in to having a stakeholder visioning that unifies and does not silo your organization so you can move forward with your UX initiatives, okay? So we need to do that. We need to think about your role and how you contribute to UX and strategy. And don't think you can't do anything, that you don't have a role. You're here because you think you do. And I'm here to tell you, and we're here to tell you that you do. So don't shy away from this. Okay. Now, in deepening your
Yeah,
skill,
just a quick point
yeah,
on that,
yeah,
just
go
to
ahead.
kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
underline that.
yeah,
Everyone, especially if you're a UX professional, is either guided by or influences both the UX strategy and the business strategy. So, um, at the very least, you need to understand and align to it. And again, it will help your portfolio and your own articulation of your personal value as well as your org's value to do so. But hopefully, you're in a position where you're a little bit more um, active in kind of influencing rather than just being guided. But at the very least, you need to kind of be able to articulate how your decisions are aligned to the UX strategy.
totally. I love that, Rob. And this is really important because we're here not just to tell you about UX strategy, but we want to help you in your careers and your growth and how you can influence your organizations and to become better that way. So this is helpful for your portfolios, like Rob was saying, and your skill sets, and talking more about your contributions on projects and really improving your skill sets by what we're talking about here is staying current on your skill sets, improving them. What you're doing right now, guys, is awesome for keeping on top of the latest trends and understandings in your organizations, in your job searches, going to these events, conferences, participating with organizations like this, signing up with newsletters, is a great way to stay on top of this. Also, the CUA certification, which a lot of you maybe either have or familiar with, is really great. Or you could get a master's and maybe both, but master's, it's 2 or more years and can be very costly and disruptive in your work schedule potentially, where our certification is very accessible. It really brings about a lot of the skills that you need to succeed and in the UX industry, and we have over 11,000 CUAs worldwide. In addition, we have these courses that you could take for the CUA. You pass our exam, you get certified. You're part of this community of over 11,000 worldwide, which is a great recognized thing that people look for. HR folks look for on resumes now. Are you CUA certified? Is a question that they will oftentimes ask. Now, with regard to UX strategy, we actually have a course that goes into some much more detail. It's our UX strategy course, an omnichannel course, okay? And we have these other courses too that are part of our CXA track, which is our CXA certification, okay? So think about that. See if the CUA and or CXA may be, or even just that UX strategy course might be something that to consider. And we want to leave you with this question of, again, you are empowered to make this difference in your organization, as Rob has mentioned. Ask yourself how UX training can help you in your role to advance your company's design culture and outcomes and UX strategy, right? So think about that. We want you to make a difference in the world, in your organization, and in your careers. And with that, Judy.
Guys, thank you so much. That was just excellent. Really good. I
Mm,
hope everyone enjoyed it. I want to let you know I will be sending a recording of this to everybody, and I'm going to ask about the slide deck. See if we can share the slide deck. Why don't you give Rob and Abdul a round of applause? That was very well put together and so well presented, and I really appreciate it. And I'll be emailing everybody, but we would love to get your feedback on this. Anything you'd like to share. Also, we have some other webinars planned that we're going to start working on similar to this. And so be looking for your email for those kind of things. So, everybody, have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much.
thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
all. Bill.
Enjoy.
Thank
Thank
you.
you guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.